Welcome back, everybody. Just want to give everybody a second or two to get tuned in. Again, I'm actually not a transformed Bob Marin, but it's my pleasure to introduce our panel for this first discussion session this morning, and we'll be going up until right about noon to hear from our panelists and hopefully have some time for discussion. We're going to be monitoring the chat, so if you have some questions or comments as we go along, we're going to be keeping track of those, and hopefully we'll have time to get to your thoughts. So you have already met Gary and Mark, I'm sorry. I just want to introduce very briefly our other panelists, and then we're going to call on folks to give their comments. First of all, Wanda Guthrie. I think if people have their, oh, there she is. Wanda Guthrie is the chair for Environmental Justice Committee at the Thomas Merton Center in Pittsburgh. Grant Ervin is the Chief Resilience Officer and Assistant Director for the Department of City Planning in Pittsburgh. So welcome, Grant. Keris Myrick is Director of the JED Foundation and Co-Director of the Mental Health Strategic Impact Initiative. And she also serves on the board of the National Association of Peer Specialists and is a certified personal medicine coach. And also we have Fred Brown, who is president and CEO of the Forbes Fund, and that is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so why don't we start with Fred and ask him to give his comments about his work and the impact that climate change has had for him and his organization.
Thank you for having me on. This is a very important set of dialogues I think we need to have. And I feel like my emotional response to climate change is one of exhaustion. In 2001, I got trained in Climate Justice Corps at Al Gore's training in San Francisco, and was identified as a 21st century environmental justice leader. And I think the problem is, well, one of the challenges is there's a lot of theoretical conversation about what's going on, not a lot of metaphysical action. And so I find it exhausting to have these very in-depth conversations when we need to be moving people to action and rapidly prototype responses that begin to share with people ways to mitigate risks. The skills that I possess are, quite simple. In 2009, I returned to Pittsburgh. In 2014, we helped the Lormer community achieve a $30 million Choice Neighborhood Award built on the framework of building a sustainable green community. That work launched us into looking at the comprehensive nature of people beyond buildings, which launched some work I do with Christine Mondor on eco districts. And then in the last 45 months as president and CEO of the Forbes Funds, we froze our assets and restructured our grant making and look at the work Einstein alluded to. You can't solve a problem with the same energy that created it. And so we restructured our grant making to look at strategic collaborations, and all of our investments in the sector have been based upon two frameworks: the social determinants of health and the UN SDGs. As I think about the role of implementing change, we have to take into account, and this is what's critical in my analysis, is we can have all the workshops in the world, but in the US, 20% of the US controls 93% of the wealth. At some point, resources have to be allocated to create systemic change within the proposed ecosystems. We know by 2050, 70% of the world's population will live in an urban corridor, and both facilitators, or all three today, mentioned the current dynamic. In the last 80 months in Allegheny County, in 3 epicenters, property values have increased as much as 217%. In those areas, we've pushed resilient people to first and second ring suburbs. So in addition to climate change, we have economic unrest that's occurring within the city of Pittsburgh, which is creating other shocks and stressors to people's personal ecosystems. And so when I think about how our organization can contribute and who we're looking at as strategic partners, certainly Grant Ervin has been one for the last 20 years in multiple roles that he's played. The Force Funds, I think, is doing cutting edge work in this particular area. Women for a Healthy Environment is another group. The Homewood Children's Village is another group. Green Building Alliance is another group. And I would say at the micro and meso level, Urban Can. At a national level, I would look at the Cancer-Free Economy Network's efforts, Transition Towns, and Eco Districts Protocol. And at the global level, I would look at the role of the UN. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. That was helpful to hear your thoughts. I apologize that I forgot one of our panelists. Ken Thompson is going to join our panel also. And Ken is a longtime friend and has been the medical director for the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Leadership Council and has done a great deal of work in this area and around Pittsburgh. We also might want to have the other folks join us, Gary and Mark. So that being the case, since you just joined us, Ken, would you like to make some comments next?
Sure, Wes, and I'll try to be really brief here. Obviously, we've got lots of folks to hear from. I'm just going to try to bring this home a little bit with essentially 3 minutes worth of comment, maybe just a little bit more. The first is to bring this home in the sense that we actually live in the epicenter of the Anthropocene. We're the place that all this stuff really kicked off and started. Coal has been here always and was used a lot, even before the steel industry kicked up. Oil was first discovered up in Titusville in 1859. Pittsburgh was described as hell with the lid off in 1868 because it was burning so much coal. We had the growth of the steel mills and really lived off the extraction zone. And I could argue that we probably became one of the wealthiest places in history because of our location next to the huge coal seams that go through the Appalachian Mountains. So that's our history, that's our legacy. UPMC and the University of Pittsburgh are largely here because of the money that came from extraction. And the health center that we all sit in is built largely with the capacity of steel workers and the unions that came out of the steel industry. So we are all intimately and directly connected to this history of extraction and what it brought to this region. We're also connected to the fact that we probably have lived through, those of us who've been here in the last 30 years, a real example of decarbonization. The fall of the steel mills meant that the amount of coal that was burnt in this area actually dramatically decreased. And that has caused lots and lots of problems. It made us a less smoky city, but I want to emphasize that, that this process of decarbonization has casualties, it has costs, and we need to make sure that we pay attention to them. So the deaths of despair, the notion that particularly in working class, less educated communities, we are seeing huge amounts of addiction and ODs, suicides, alcohol-related deaths. These are the costs of the deindustrialization that we experienced. It's a decarbonization. That's a positive thing, but we have to really think about how we make sure that the folks who are at the losing end of that don't lose everything and all things. So I want to talk a little bit about the idea of the just transition and think about what it is that we can do to mitigate the challenges that fall not only on all of us because of climate change, but particularly to those communities that have been built around extraction zones, that have made their livings around that, and have supplied all of us with the resources that we have to get to where we are today, to now begin to think about how we help those communities change. And I'm going to just call on a couple historical facts and build us, build on that for a future. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, founded in Pittsburgh in 1881 because we had moved into the industrial era. I think we now just need to start thinking about what kind of community and solidarity efforts are we going to develop and found, possibly even here in Pittsburgh, as we move forward. We have some indications of that, and I'm going to just mention two. One of them is the notion of solidarity care, and that is different than clinical care. That is a capacity for communities to heal, people in community to heal each other. It ties very much to the notions that Gary was talking about before about transfer of capacity. It ties very much to the social actions that people have talked about, but it builds on this idea of how it is that we can create the capacity within communities and within people to manage the extraordinary challenges that are going to come with decarbonization. We also have an example of inward investment, and I encourage people to take a look at the Marshall Plan for Middle America, which has been developed as a way to bring energy self-sufficiency back to this region, but to do it in a way that isn't burning carbon, and at the same time begins to build the capacity for people to have jobs in communities that support them and create the kind of communities that we are all hoping we can live in. So the solidarity care and inward investment with things like the Marshall Plan are really critical. I have been working particularly in an area of solidarity care called integrated community therapy, which we are hoping to bring to this region, and I'm keen to talk about that at some other point. But for right now, I will stop there.
Wes, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Ken. I failed to get my mute off. Good comments, and thank you for making those. Why don't we go to Keris next and ask her to give her observations.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm always curious how I end up in certain places and spaces, since this is not something I've ever actually spoken about before. So thanks for that. I think I'll start with this sort of my emotional response is always one of, yeah, total overwhelm. I mean, there's just so much going on just in the world alone that sometimes trying to add yet another thing in my head about it tends to be overwhelming. But I think one of the skills that I brought to this space, whether I knew I was doing it or not, whether I called it climate change or environmentalism or anything, is a capacity for great creativity and innovation. And I'm not waiting for evidence for something. I think Fred may have said that earlier. It's like, come on, let's just move, right? So one of the things I think about, especially for people living with mental health conditions and for those that we serve in the public mental health system, is that we call this a vulnerable population, and there are things that impact our folks from food insecurity, poverty, employment, NIMBYism, and the like. And interestingly enough, when we were doing work in a peer-run organization, I ran a peer-run organization in Los Angeles County, and we were really struggling with a lot of the boarding cares and a lot of the smoke and coking, that happens in boarding cares. And people said they were giving us feedback that the food was really crummy. They did not have access to fresh food and vegetables. And I said, well, we could do urban gardening. I said, let's do urban gardening. I'm in LA, so it's all urban, where people are living. And again, sort of these boarding cares are segregated out too into areas that actually nobody wants to live in, right? So and then, the response was, well, how can we do urban gardening? It's all concrete. So I went to Huntington Libraries and Garden, in which they had actually taken over an eminent domain public garden that was in Compton. And I asked them, can they help us think about urban gardening at our boarding cares? And it was amazing. They pulled together all of the resources. We were able to bring some people from the boarding cares to Huntington Garden and Library to learn about urban gardening. They provided a TA to the boarding care. There were boarding cares in Pasadena where the Huntington Gardens and Library is located. They put us in touch with tree people so that they could actually plant some trees that could bear fruit, which course makes perfectly good sense in a place where we grow oranges. I don't know. So, but really what happened is that we were able to help the people who were the service recipients, who generally we think of as we need to help them. We need to help them, as people are saying, connect the dots. The dots were connected. We just needed to help them see the power within themselves to be able to take part in and take charge in what they could do to resolve some of these issues. So at the end of the day, they had their garden. The owner of the boarding care was amazed about how much money they were actually saving. And they didn't want to give the residents knives to cut the fruit. It was ridiculous. They were like, oh, they're not going to be patient. So people learned lots of different skills, from cooking skills to being safe in the kitchen. So suddenly knives were now allowed, so ridiculous. And then also they learned about patience, because everybody thought, well, these folks can't be patient, so we're going to work with them and just let them be impatient. I'm like, no, we can help them teach, we can help with the patience. So they learned gardening, farming, cooking, patience. They also took the extra fruit and vegetables that they were not able to use, and they sold it at a farmer's market. And people recognized that, wow, now these folks actually have meaning and purpose in their lives. They have employment, they have funding, and they became an integral part of the community. And we know that reducing stigma about mental health conditions relies on having positive interactions with people with mental health conditions. So this created opportunities for the community, for the farmers market, to have these positive interactions with folks with mental health conditions. So this is how sort of my brain works, is how many problems can I solve at one time? So I think I solved a lot of problems right there at one time. And really, I look at this as, I love the slide about flourishing that aligns very well when we talk about the domains of recovery, health, home, purpose, and community, to move towards flourishing, help the community take charge by giving them the resources, using our resources that are already in community, and being just darn creative. So lastly, when I worked at the LA County Department of Mental Health, there are over 6,000 employees at the Department of Mental Health. And now think of what we're doing there. And I'm just going to say, one of the things that struck me is we were ordering paper cards or business cards to give out to people. And I said, well, wait a minute, how many cards is that? That's ridiculous. So I actually asked somebody to help me out with this idea. And now this is in bamboo. The one I don't have is bamboo, and I don't work for the county anymore. But so this is a business card. One, I don't need 5,000. I only need one. And on the back of it, I work for the Department of Mental Health, right? And then anybody can just scan the code to get the contact information and the website. I don't need to order this over and over. And then the program behind it can actually change if my phone number changes, if my title changes, so I don't have to reorder and order. Now, reality, this is plastic. Again, he has now made these into bamboo, but I think this is just like one simple step. But it's a simple step that really, if everybody took it, how many trees are we going to save? How much printing are we going to save? Things like that. So I don't know, those are my comments, and they're built on hope. They're built on community capacity, the capacity of the people we serve, not seeing them as recipients and things we have to do things to, but people, as Ken and others have said, we will partner with to resolve some of these intractable issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Keris. For somebody who hasn't thought about this or spoke about this so much in the past, you kind of covered a lot of ground, and I think really pointed out some really simple ways that everybody can contribute. So let me go next to Wanda and ask her to give her comments.
Well, I have to say, I really loved the three people who spoke today, and I want to tell Gary how much I enjoyed the last quotation by Adrienne Marie Brown and from Emergent Strategies, um, and it reminded me of uh, the trilogy by Octavia Butler. God is change, and I am a spiritual person. I am a Quaker, and I'm a Franciscan, and I'm a religious naturalist. And I have to say that I easily, because of doing peace and social justice work for years, I easily and quickly go to righteous anger. Righteous anger is my go to, and it feels so good. So it's a wake up call for me. What else is there to do besides be angry? And so I have to say that when we're making decisions about what we do, I really resonated with Mark's observation that we have concerns and we have aspirations, and in between we have a gap. And this is a gap that is best served by community, how we have relationships with others. And so I continue to stay in religious communities because this is a place where we can gather to have to talk about the gaps and come up with as many harebrained schemes and good stuff as we can. And so I encourage that as a person of faith. I have to say that St. Francis, on his deathbed, he said, I have done what was mine to do. May Christ teach you what is yours. And I think this is where we are when we talk about all of the solutions and the situations and the story. Um, I think that the most important thing for me at this point in time is finding a new story that can encompass the world as a living organism in a matrix of what it means to love, to love, to love the world, to recognize ourselves as a cell in this expanding universe, and to really work on emergent conversation and dialogue. I have to say that when Mary Beth was talking about her photos, I look at her photos on Facebook all the time. That's a matrix. I mean, there it is, all these wonderful places and parts of nature that restore us. Um, and so I have to say that social activism, what we do, is more than do-goodism, because we are embedded in the place where we live, and we are part of what this culture is now. Thomas Berry says that reinventing the human at the species level is the most important thing that we can do at this time. And so I just have to let you know that we clearly can't do everything, that when one of us is doing one thing and another is doing another, it is the process of how we invite people into the emergent conversations and the spirit uh, which leads us here, and um, and to loving to invent and be with the new story worldwide. And I thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Wanda. That was great in a unique kind of perspective, I think, that you bring to this. So I want to go next to Grant Ervin. And Grant, if you want to give your thoughts as well.
Yes, thanks, Wes, and it's great to be with you all today. It's also, I think, interesting to be in for me personally, a cross-sector conversation. So working with mental health professionals and folks in the medical field, maybe but for Ken Thompson, is a bit of an anomaly for me. So the majority of my day is spent with policymakers and engineers and practitioners in municipal government and infrastructure conversations. So this is a refreshing dialogue for me. I would say my emotional response is one of frustration. And that frustration is really born between the disconnects between activism and action. And so understanding the needs of what has to transpire between what I'll use the analogy of changing light bulbs versus reducing emissions. And so they're very interconnected decisions that we have to make with regards to our consumption patterns. And it's that action that requires a lot more engagement from the professions and practitioners in order to accelerate the activism of what activism is requiring. The skills and the resources that I bring are one of being an integrator and of being a policy engineer. So my work is really about looking across sectors, across conversations, in order to find what we call in the resilience space co-benefits, or the ability to leverage multi-systemic opportunities that create the multiple amount of benefits across different communities. In terms of the important or most important climate decisions, I'd kind of offer three that I use as kind of guideposts for my work. One is the idea around the need to drill down to draw down. In Mark's presentation, he used the book Drawdown as one of his inspirations, and I would agree with it. In fact, if I was able to reach across my room, I'd pick up my copy of that book and you would see highlights, underlines, dog ears, and everything in between, and a couple of coffee stains. And it provides a roadmap with regards to what we as a species need to do in order to both reduce emissions, but also to create a stronger sense of humanity. What's missing in that book, or what I'd offer for the authors, needs to be the 2.0 of that, or the second version, is how do you translate that work into action? So getting the accountants, the lawyers, the budget directors to effectively take into their work the application of those recommendations. And that's part of the challenges that I deal with every day. The second, I would say, is a need to take on a better sense and advance what I call energy-oriented development, and effectively thinking about our consumption patterns and how we engage in the built and natural environment. And by thinking about energy first, it allows us to make more intuitive decisions with regards to both natural systems, but also our built systems. So if you take the city of Pittsburgh, for example, like most cities, our emissions come from two major sources: buildings and transportation systems. And just in the last, I guess really the last 2.5 years, if you look at that time span, incorporating the year 2020, obviously somewhat of an anomaly, we saw very clearly the impacts of the human footprint. So in the city of Pittsburgh, our emissions dropped by about 20% in the year 2020 as a result of our lack of mobility activity. And so we published some of this information with our partners at Google that clearly demonstrate the footprint that we have from our transportation choices. Which leads to, one of my other frustrations with that is that story was not covered. If I asked how many people saw the press release or knew that that transpired, I would beg to look at across this audience, and very few people would raise their hands. Which leads to kind of the third piece in terms of most important to climate. And it's really about connecting our value chains with our supply chains. That really starts with kind of the idea that our consumption practices, both in terms of overconsumption, but also what we do need to consume, really needs to be connected with the values that we espouse. And that is practices that can be handled both inside of your own individual decisions or your household, as well as your organizations. In Gary's presentation, he offered up some connections with regards to the Sustainable Development Goals, some work that both Fred and I have been very intimately involved with here locally. One of the things that we've done with the city of Pittsburgh, and we'll release actually next week, is a connection called the Voluntary Local Review, or basically linking the Sustainable Development Goals to the work that and services that we provide as the city of Pittsburgh. And this year's Voluntary Local Review will focus on procurement, something that nobody here would, very few people, unless there's a procurement officer in the room, would find be very exciting, but it's basically our spend. So how we are spending our dollars with regards to operational services, and what are those connections to that spend, to our goals and values in the Sustainable Development Goals. And so finally, I would just kind of leave, with what organizations you work with. I'd highlight, Fred gave a really good example in the Forbes funds in terms of how they have shifted their investment practices. And this is a really critical kind of lens that we have to apply. Here is an organization that, Fred will give you the real details, but 15 to 20 years old, probably a little bit older than that, that has been going along, doing a lot of great work, but we all have to stop and think how we are making those investments. In the city, one of the things that we've done in the last year and a half is engaged with an organization called Resource X, which is effectively a technology firm that provides budgeting software, which, there's a lot of budgeting software out there for local governments, for hospitals and universities. But one of the things that we did was that we applied a climate and equity lens to our budget. And so what that has effectively done is allowed us to align, again, those Sustainable Development Goals and our investment decisions. And so, the thing that I would look is what types of organizations to work with. Look to organizations that are starting to change their investment practices based upon these needs that we have. Final piece I've saw in the chat, like one of the issues that's come up about the topic of divestment. One of the things that we've done at the city of Pittsburgh is that we've created an ESG policy, or environmental social governance policy, for our pension fund. And this is now extended into our budget process, as well as with the procurement and voluntary local review that I mentioned. That type of lens has reduced our exposure to fossil fuel investments to less than 1%. So when we talk about how and where we move our money, that's $700 million for city pensioners who no longer have exposure to not just fossil fuels, but also guns and ammo manufacturers and for-profit prisons. So the integration of the concepts of the Sustainable Development Goals into our pension fund is creating a more holistic investment position for us. These things are all doable. And what is required is the ability to link the advocacy with the practitioners to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. That was great. And I think this panel has really been diverse in its views. And I think, when we talk about hope, your comments really give us a little bit of hope in terms of how all the various pieces need to come together to make some change. I want to just invite Gary to make any additional comments that he has. I know that you have to leave, Gary, a little bit before the hour, so please make any additional comments that you have.
Well, sure, thanks. I really resonated with some things that particularly Fred was saying about, ultimately what Congress does or doesn't do. This is a ground game. And, all the work, and Grant, you mentioned, changing so much, how so many systems work and value things instead of in a monetized way, but a public goods way. What are the public goods outcome of what we do? To embed that is a lot of heavy lifting, and most of it is going to have to happen at the local level and at the ground level, and through work like yours, Grant and Fred, through Forbes Fund kind of organizations that are really capacity builders to local civic muscle. And so, if you think, if you remember that map that I put up with all those dots, where I see this mental health community as being useful is, one, being able to deploy what we can know in that kind of spatialized way to add to an element to that capacity building. We're starting to talk about social infrastructure in this country, although that got dialed back a bit in the path of the Build Back Better Act. But just as we need to invest in a lot of hardware, new energy sources, production systems, et cetera, we really have to invest in this social software and this civic software to be able to do stuff, to seize the local change, culture change, microeconomic change, and all of that has to be, and it's been sort of softly spoken, but needs to be loudly spoken, has to be done in ways that overthrow the rigidity of our capitalist, colonialist, racist, genderist mind frames and norms that have guided classist norms that have guided the distribution of our economic productivity. And if we're going to redistribute that through public goods, through local action and capacity building, it's really got to front and center face those things. Someone in the chat, and then I'll be quiet, mentioned, what other issues are the victims of this social fraying? And every issue. It has hobbled this country to be a great country, that we have not invested in civic muscle because we have not respected all of our, all the parts of our localities, all the contributions, and acknowledged all the ways that we've oppressed, killed, and harmed other members of our national community. And unless we don't face up to that, not only with the flow of resources, but in the real investments in civic muscle, we're not going to have the ground game to get through this and solve not just the readiness for climate, but look at the public health crisis we just went through. We couldn't even all agree to put freaking masks on because those same structures and norms were in play, rather than the conditions for caring and mutuality and mutual respect and other regarding ways of using our public goods. So that micro level work is critical, and it's something we can all do. It's in our neighborhood. And as mental health professionals, to take on these other roles of partnering with others to improve their resilience, to improve their effectiveness, to do this work, that's where we should be going. And that's very tangible and possible to do. And there are huge examples. I showed how we supersized it in New York. What Ken is doing in Pittsburgh, you should all do. You should all be, however many participants are on now, I lost track of the number. All 82 of us should be doing that kind of care solidarity groups that he's talking about all over Pittsburgh. That's the kind of army we need, but it has to be through groups like Fred and his networks. I'm working with environmental justice group networks. Mental health is a means to their ends. It's not the end in itself. So we have to restructure how we do the work to do that. And I apologize, I'm giving a talk in Glasgow virtually, and I have to get off in a couple of minutes. So I apologize for that departure, but this has been a rich discussion. And I think Pittsburgh, you've got the wherewithal to lead how our, how our cities can put the power on the ground to do this work.
Thanks.
Before you
Go ahead, Bob.
before you go, Gary,
You're your speaker.
I didn't mean to leave silence in that.
So think about the approach to political electedom.
Did people get that comment? I don't know if Bob's microphone was.
I see. Why don't you just reiterate it for me? To the question, guys, before you're running, I was just thinking that you might say strategically, and in order to be sort of practical, what's the way you think about the approach to be taken to elected officials?
Oh my God.
I don't need a total perfectly successful solution, but just in terms of kind of being
Whatever comes to your mind, be obnoxious and aggressive and push these messages. I don't think there's a secret sauce to that. I think our elected class has not been truth telling to the people about how bad things are, and the depth of civic mobilization and investment is needed to get there, which means respect and correcting all the structures that have walled off that civic investment at the center of our collective purposes. And so just be unabashedly truthful, but prove the concepts on the ground. That to me has always been the best argument to a local politician, is show this, we mean doing that over there. We need to do more of that over there.
Yeah, one comment that I would make, I think, is that awareness is really so critical, and talking with people about this, in ways that Bob has mentioned, that Ken has mentioned, but also just in our personal interactions, because in places like Pittsburgh, where some of the climatic disruptions are less visible, it's easy to deny these things. And so, I think that one thing we need to be cognizant of is just kind of keeping this topic on the table all the time. So thanks very much, Gary, before you leave. And I just wanted to also give Mark another chance to make some additional comments before we go to a more general discussion.
Thank you. It's just been great to hear all the chorus of voices calling for more action. You've already heard many of my thoughts. I have many more. I've been taking notes as people have been sharing comments. But a couple of things that really jumped to my mind. I think that the comments about unleashing the sort of the creative capacity, I feel that there's an intense need of unleashing the creative capacity of the global community on this issue, and that's stymied by racial and economic and other injustice. That, by keeping people out of the pathways of productive education and flourishing, those people become preoccupied with survival instead of ideation and exploration of all the essential things that we need. And clearly the people who already have access to those things are not able to solve the problem because it's not being solved. And so I think we need more people at the table. We need to do that, I think, by unleashing their genius and enabling them. And in many ways, I feel that comes from, the big part of the problem that we're looking at with climate change is that a lot of the fossil fuels, molecule by molecule of CO2 and other greenhouse gases were emitted into the atmosphere, and people made dollars off of each one of those molecules that went into the atmosphere. I think we need to, and that created this sort of pile of wealth here that I think it's the moral obligation of humanity to liquidate that pile of wealth to the extent necessary to put all that CO2 back underground. That's how the money was earned in the first place, was making the problem, and the money is just sitting there making more problems, and we can route it back to help put that money, put the carbon back underground. A few points of concern that I'm concerned about correlating the decline of Pittsburgh with a decarbonization. We did, emit a lot less emissions, have a lot less emissions after the collapse of the steel industry here, but I feel like correlating it with that process puts a negative light on it that I think is not necessary, given that I see decarbonization as a process that is highly planned, thoughtful, putting people in, putting those in the workers' position at the front of the line of support and assistance, and that it's inherently tied to this sort of new process of decarbonization that I think we're heading into is going to be inextricably tied to the massive creation of jobs, largely because the energy from renewables comes not from fuel and getting this stuff out of the ground, but from the products and structures that we build and set up and that workers assemble. And then once that's assembled and the work is done, then the energy just comes with some limited maintenance. But it's different from getting the stuff out of the ground and accumulating it and constantly needing effort and energy and money in that process. So a lot of the money exchanged there is through the work, not through the stuff. And I think that's a really important thing to consider as we go forward. And then one other concern, I do like most of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but goal number 8, I've always had a concern about it, and that is that it calls for decent work, awesome, and economic growth. I'm not so sure that that's so awesome. I think that if we build the entirety of our sustainability off of a platform of economic growth, we're going to land into the same kind of problems that we've been encountering over the last few hundred years. And so I think that we need to think perhaps more of the growth of resilience, which I know Grant has been deeply engaged with foundation funding. I think that the growth of resilience is maybe a better way to focus growth than just sort of repeating the economic growth elements there. There's a comments about Clairton. I have lots of comments about air quality in Clairton. I'm working on a documentary about it called Inversion at inversiondoc.com. I feel that polluters like US Steel need to clean up Clairton or shut it down. It's that simple, and there's a lot of pressure that can be put on people, organizations, institutions. In fact, there was a grassroots group that I'm involved with working on air quality that was calling for institutions like UPMC to speak up about air pollution, because air pollution in our region is highly correlated with fossil fuel combustion, and it's also highly correlated with economic and racial and gender injustice. And by addressing these things head on through the most visible symptoms like air pollution, I think that we can make serious progress on cutting our carbon emissions. And cutting carbon emissions is something that US Steel has actually said that they're really for, and they're actually having trouble getting the local workers to agree to a decarbonization of the industry here. So it's sort of like it's a strange mix of dynamics there now that US Steel is so eager to reduce their emissions. So there's a lot at play here, and I'm happy to go into more conversation.
Thank you, Mark. Grant, it looked like you had something that you wanted to put in, and so let me go to you. And there's a question for you also from Carissa Caban-Alaman regarding perhaps saying a little bit more about how to implement climate action across sectors and how can mental health professionals help with that.
Yeah, and I'm going to leave with this because I also have to be in Glasgow in a couple minutes here, virtually. I put this in the chat, but this is kind of one of my reflections, and so I apologize for any misuse of terminology. But that one of the things that we see here is the lack of recognition that we are doing self-harm by a lot of our choices that we make. And so whether those are transportation decisions or consumption patterns or how we heat and cool our homes. And so those are all related to the individual choices or the business choices that the organizations that we work with undertake. The second is that there is a challenge in the mental complexity of change related to risk aversion. And so a lot of the challenges that we have are basically overcoming status quo processes because they've quote unquote worked. And people are not empowered or feel that they can take the liberties to change the systems that they're within. And so, you know, anything that you have seen coming out of the city of Pittsburgh over the last 7+ years in the work that we have done has been the result of helping people recognize that they are doing self-harm and that they are trying to alleviate the challenges that people have with risk aversion. So finding kind of those win-win solutions that allow things to progress. And the other thing that I think that just to make mention too, and this picks up some of the stuff that Ken was talking about, is one of the greatest challenges that we have in the whole climate debate is the issues with regards to loss and displacement. And so you see this, you know, in environmental justice communities, both in urban settings as well as in rural contexts as well. And it is one of those challenges that you see in terms of how to alleviate that fear and the reality that exists with displacing people that are in the industries that have effectively powered our economy over the last 100+ years. And so we have to provide ways in which are ultimately positive alternatives that, you know, allow people to make that transition. And that's really kind of the challenge of the work that we're at. And so I think there's an intersection there with regards to the connection between climate and how we can educate both practitioners such as myself to use kind of the, you know, typical trainings that are found in the mental health space, to use those in the work environments to facilitate change. And so that leads to kind of like the answer to the question is, you know, cross-sector collaboration really requires people and stakeholders, you know, coming and finding a common ground and finding a place where they can convene, they can communicate, and ultimately find ways in which to build solutions together. I'll give you a really, you know, I'll leave with it kind of this example of one that is close to UPMC and close to all of us, I think, in Pittsburgh, is that we're facilitating a conversation right now with regards to an energy master plan for Oakland. And Oakland is one of the critical energy hubs across the region from a consumption standpoint. And there is a deep history with regards to transitioning from fuel sources. You know, Ken mentioned kind of going from coal to gas or wood to coal to gas. And now we have to go from gas to electricity and electricity that is powered by renewable power. And so as we think about kind of the physical spaces that we are in, both our residential homes, as well as kind of our commercial and industrial sector, we have to transition that energy conversation. And so using those lessons, I think, from mental health in terms of kind of, you know, recognizing the harm that we're doing, that everybody's going to have a sense of risk or a tolerance for risk, and how do we allay that, and mitigating the impacts of loss and displacement effectively can help us accelerate the transition.
Thanks a lot, Grant. Appreciate your comments, and good luck in Glasgow.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks for joining us. Before we go to other questions, are there any other comments from our panel? I think Bob has been collecting some questions that we might ask him to share with us at this point.
I just have one comment, if I can make it, if that's okay, Wes.
Please do, yeah.
I just would ask us all to consider, as we think about solutions, that we use the term loosely in the city about co-creation, iteration, agility. There's not a lot of good evidence that we're doing that. It's a lot of good evidence we're saying that. And so when we start thinking about solutions, they need to be grounded in a transformational framework that's regenerative, that looks at the ecosystems of resilient communities and not just the brilliant brains that are on this call and other calls. There has to be a marriage with how local people see solutions that could be bridled by the technology that's available within our constructs that strive towards a shared trajectory for the region. And I think that's totally being missed as we look at being reactionary to problems versus being proactive. And what is the construct by which we create that paradigm shift? And I think we're missing that. And so I just want to caution us to be conscientious about that as we go from macro level analysis, academic pursuits to how is this sustained given the gap between the haves and have-nots, in particular in Southwestern PA.
Right, that was part of the question I had in mind here. I didn't have ready access to the framework that you give words to, but answering that question might be helpful for us. I'm thinking about 2 examples that you might offer us, a step or 2 that folks not directly involved with kind of governmental systems or large organizations, 2 examples of ways to think about a next step for ourselves as individuals if we want to be contributing to the development of that, what would you say, co-created agile ecosystem. Okay, that's a little abstract for me. Okay, I think I could sort of attach some particulars to it, but you'd probably be able to do it a lot quicker than I could. What will be an example of how that might look for me if I go home tonight and sit down with my family and people want to know, what are you going to do different next
Well, one of
Monday?
the things is, thank you for Bob for bringing that up. So if we're talking about the role of mental health, there's an assumption that what's happening in one community is having the same weight and bearing on another. That's not true. You know, many resilient peoples are already functioning in a hypervigilant mode. So the stress and shocks that we're talking about don't affect them the same way it affects people from dominant cultural pedagogy. For some of them, this is the first time they've ever had to confront the reality that their lives are going to be impacted by some external locus of control. For people of color, for 400 years, they've had that experience. And so this is nothing new, right? The issue and the gap I'm referring to, Bob, is so if we come to this realization that we have to be bridge builders, how does mental health work in conjunction with organizations like Minds and Grants at the city level to really do more than just educate people about the mental health sector and the dichotomy that exists with treatment, but moreover into a longitudinal framework that there's a deeper abiding non-post positive analysis of the problem that, because here's the real issue, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. We have gotten away from caring and doing more doing, and the doing has been driven by technology. And that's really driving us apart, because even in these homes during COVID, we saw that there were certain communities that could rapidly move to working from home, teaching from home, and then a whole nother segment that couldn't do any of that. There was an assumption that would just happen. And so I just want to say, if we're practical, right, and say, Bob, and you go home and say, what we're going to do is we're going to target 10 families, or we're going to work strategically with 3 community groups that we think their sphere of influence is X. We're going to go in there once a week, twice a week. We're going to offer mental health analysis in conjunction with your understanding of the ecosystem and see how we can prescribe immediate, midterm, and long-term solutions that help people grapple with the issue of climate change and how might they respond differently if prepared or exposed to other tools. The issue with the tools that we're talking about, people don't feel like those tools are for them, right? Because they haven't been invited into thinking about how might they resolve the issue. And so I have a whole thinking about how we could do that differently and actually implement it as a strategy. But it starts with us having a sense of how do we operationalize our humanity. And that's why I just want to say, you know, the things we've been most successful at, and I'll use the relationship we had with Pitt with bringing a PhD student in. He worked with us for 5 years. And I told Pitt I didn't want any 13-week students. I wanted a long-term relationship where the community could trust this person from the university, build relationships with them, begin to divulge the things that are important, that are intimate, in a way that they believe that person sincerely cared about them, and they work together to create solutions. And what I warned our practitioners about was they would be greatly impacted by how these people live their lives. They had no idea. And once they saw how people were living their lives, they were flabbergasted by, for example, you know, one of our practitioners was like, to get to our meeting, we had somebody that has to catch 4 buses. I just got my car and drove here. And I said, those are the kind of things that we take for granted. Will people navigate to just get knowledge? And then if we give them knowledge and it's not translatable into an action, we've wasted that time. And so those are the kind of things I would allude to. Is once we get to the planning part, what is the tangible action and who is responsible to support that, both from its inception to the eventual handoff, that community begins to take ownership of how they drive that particular solution.
Thank you, Fred. I saw that Keris has her hand up, so do you want to make?
Yeah. Yeah, I did. I just wanted to follow up with Fred Brown's comments and saying that, you know, this is exactly where the peer community is so valuable. And, you know, if we think about mental health as, again, sort of psychiatrists coming in and doing their thing, that is pretty scary, I would say, to a lot of people, especially to Black and Brown folks. However, you know, when you're talking about community co-production and co-design, you're talking about also that peers are from the communities many times in which they're providing those services and supports. So that collaborative work with peers who are experiencing a lot of the issues that are happening in communities to partner with in the co-design process is going to be critically important. And I think also for a lot of people, it's that a trusted cultural broker, if you will. So that's another way to think about it. And doing it not after the planning, but throughout the whole process of what's needed, how it's needed, whatever. So, and I think, you know, again, when Mr. Brown was talking about technology and COVID, we had been saying all along, people do not have access to technology, even though psychiatry was behind in telehealth. And I hate to say it, we were behind because of we know why we were behind, because of the telehealth rules, et cetera, that have been lifted during COVID. I said, fine, you can lift those during COVID for the practitioners, but you're not lifting anything or supporting people in community who don't even have access to that stuff in order to even participate. It's so funny. And unfortunately, the reason I have to leave early is I'm presenting to on the American Psychological TMS, Technology, Mind, and Science, about some of these very issues about, you know, technology cannot be the end all be all if people don't have access to it. How do we partner with communities to find out what they need, how they need it, when they need it? So I just wanted to double down on the power of partnering with peer support specialists in order to have access also to community members and problem solving and solution development.
Thank you, Keris. I also saw that Mark had his hand raised. Did you want to chime in, Mark?
Yeah, I was just kind of reflecting on the things that Fred was saying, and I appreciate that, Fred. And I think that when I think of like what it looks like to me to tell someone at a dinner table, you know, that about how we're going to actually operationalize this, and Fred, you know, check me in the chat or verbally if I'm not zeroing in on this, but I feel like it's sort of often involved like people coming together. So what is it, kiddo at the table here? It's people coming together, informed by local expertise, and that money finds them easily with low barriers to access and few constraints on how it is used. And then they try things to improve the lives of the people around them. And if they fail, we learn and then try something new. And we've set it up in such a way that careers are not broken on those outcomes, because otherwise there will be, you know, no smart or career-oriented person will attempt a thing if their career is hinging upon what's the reporting outcomes? What, does some of the money get lost, or is some of it, do the outcomes not line up with what you thought? Or are you allowed to change the target of your project midstream without having your all systems pulled out from under you? I feel like it's that kind of approach that might help to operationalize this. How do we get things going? But if we're not paying attention to how our compass is set, and this is the real delicate balance of like doing too much. I'm really sensitive to like doing for its own sake. I feel that there's so much doing that goes off in the wrong direction and then causes more harm than good. And that's a real challenge. And as a filmmaker, I try to adjust for that as by trying to do more than what is instinctually normal for someone to do in terms of listening. That you can listen, and you can listen with your mouth open or with your mouth closed. And it takes real discipline to interview someone with your mouth closed and really hear what they have to say and really deeply listen, and then go and internalize it. And maybe that involves editing it for 5 hours and just thinking about every bit of what they had to say, and then checking with them after you've done that process of listening and in distillation and internalizing, and then reflecting on how it applies to systems that you know about, maybe some that you don't know about, and then coming back and reflecting more. And it's hard to do that without money, with low constraints. It's hard to do that without time, and it's hard to do that if the consequences for problems are too high. So those are just some ways that I think about how that we might be able to change how we get our heads around that issue and tell someone about it at the dinner table.
Thanks, Mark. Any other comments from our panel? I think Bob has some questions that he would like to maybe put out there in the last few minutes that we have. We have about 5 minutes before we have our break.
Wes, I wanted to actually see if I could keep us on the same track here, but get a contribution from Ken first, whom I see has his hand up actually, and also Wanda perhaps as a wind up as well. The piece I'm thinking about, Ken and Wanda, is there's a gap here, or we're trying to bridge a gap, or we're thinking that there's a gap when there isn't, and it's just a matter of doing things in a different way. Ken talked about, I think, solidarity care and the integrated cultures process. Is there a piece of that that you could drop into the conversation here, Ken, that would speak to this issue of a gap being a place where we sit, rest, need to jump over?
Well, let me just say two things. One is, it really is important that Pittsburgh take this on. We are the progenitors of this problem, and our response is going to be important for the rest of the world. So I just want to say that we have a long history of generating institutions and ways of dealing with the challenges that being in this regions have brought to us. Not always solving our problems, but finding a way to get through some of them. And I guess what I would like to say, Bob, in order to your question, is there's a long history of community-based organizing and work-based organizing, the labor movement and community organizations that we really need to turn to historically and build on that capacity to create the foundation for the work that needs to go into the future. It's a lot less about the hierarchical powers and a lot more about the powers at the base. I think Fred has been sort of talking about that, and Keris as well. And we have to figure out, I think, how as mental health workers to connect people much more than we have been doing historically. As a job, we tend to focus on what's private, and I don't think we do a very good job about dealing with what's public. And what we're facing is a collective trauma. We have a history of collective trauma, and we should build on that.
Wanda, we're
Yeah,
coming up on our last couple of minutes, and maybe this would be a good place for you to go
sure,
ahead.
sure. I wanted to talk again about how Mark and Fred has always done this. But you do have the concerns, you do have the aspirations, in between you do have this gap. And people really need to increase their competency. And any way that that can happen, Fred, is wonderful. I just, I know you've always worked on this, and I really salute you for doing this. And Mark, the same to you. Thank you.
Thank you all for really an engaging conversation. And I think we have more of that ahead this afternoon. So we're looking forward to that. We're gonna break now for lunch. And we are gonna be, as Bob mentioned, playing the Yurt film that Mark has developed during the lunch hour. So you will have that to entertain you. And we will reconvene at 1 o'clock for our afternoon sessions.